We'll be reading from 1 Corinthians, and lessons predominantly from the 16th chapter, but I'm going to start with the last verse of the 15th. As Billy would say multiple times over and over again over the last 50 years he's been here, there was no breaks in this when it was written. All right, I'll start with verse 58. Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor of the Lord is not in vain. Now about the collection for God's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give you letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me. After I go through Macedonia, I will come to you, for I will be going through Macedonia. Perhaps I'll stay with you a while or even spend the winter so that you can help me on my journey wherever I go. I do not want to see you now and make only a passing visit. I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. But I'm going to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost because of a great door for effective work has opened up for me, and there are many who oppose me. If Timothy comes, see to it that he has nothing to fear while he's with you, for he is carrying on the work of the Lord just as I am. No one then should refuse to accept him. Send him on his way in peace so that he may return to me, because I am expecting him along with the brothers. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the day. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for the opportunity to study it. Guide us as you always. In your son's name. Okay, last week, I appreciate John filling in. He said you had an entertaining class talking about the resurrection and the resurrected body. First part of the chapter starts off, and I don't think it was in the book, wasn't in the book, so it probably wasn't discussed much. But anyway, just kind of as a recap, one of the key things in the first verse of chapter 15 was the fact that it said, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached. If you'll remember, in the very first chapter, he starts off with that and starts talking about that. But one thing that's real important to this, and make a note of it for future reference, because people will tell you the gospel is this. We have a gospel meeting. One of the things that irks me the most is we have a gospel meeting, and then they come in here and start talking about this and that and all these different things that are doctrines and beliefs and things like that. And that's not the gospel. The gospel is what the Bible says it is, and I've told you in our studies over years, most of the time, the Bible defines exactly what words mean. And here is the definition of the gospel. In the first verses there, he says, I want to remind you of chapter 15, of what I preached to you. By this gospel, you are saved. That's the first two verses, okay? So by this gospel that he's been preaching, and we've talked about the fact that all through Acts, they always preach the gospel. They preach Jesus. They preach Jesus Christ. They preach Christ crucified. That's always. They never once talk about how often we need to worship or whatever. That's what they preached. And then people became the church because they obeyed. Anyway, so here he is, the first two verses. He says that by this gospel you are saved. And then he goes on in verses 3 through 8 and defines what that is. And I don't want to spend a lot of time in it because it's really kind of behind where we are. But what it starts off by saying is, Jesus came, he lived amongst you, he was crucified on the cross. Remember chapter 1, the first thing he says is the foolishness of the cross. He was crucified, he died, he was buried, and he was resurrected. This is the gospel that I preached unto you. So when somebody says they preach the gospel, that's what they're supposed to be preaching. Not my opinion about how we should do this or do that or any other things that are part of the apostles' teaching even. Those are apostles' teachings about how to live our life as a Christian. But the gospel itself is defined as the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Goes one step further, okay? So if you wanted to do, and I had a minor in math, and I'm an engineer and all that. If you want to put it up there, gospel equals death, burial, resurrection. Let's go one step further. Remember what Romans chapter 6 says? It says, first, before we get to that, I mentioned that in the first chapter, he says, the message of the cross, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, is the foolishness to those who are dying or perishing, lost. It makes no sense. It's illogical. As a matter of fact, he compares the foolishness of God and the wisdom of man. And he goes on and he says, but the message of the cross, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, is the power of God to save. All right? And then Romans 6 goes through that same thing, talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But what else does it talk about? Does anybody remember? The death, burial, and resurrection of who? Besides Jesus. Me. Because we are united in baptism with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So in reality, when it's talking about the gospel is equal to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and those who are saved. Okay? The reality is, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection was not good news and was not worth anything unless the individual goes through the death, burial, and resurrection. Okay? Through baptism. A person can be dunked and go through the death, burial, and resurrection in water, and if Jesus never did it, it would still be worthless. It takes both. The gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and we're united in that through baptism into our own death, burial, and resurrection to be brought anew. Okay? And I say all that to say this. Beware of what he talked about in the beginning. The foolishness of the cross is the foolishness of God compared to the wisdom of man. Makes no sense. Today, we have the wisdom of man who tries to change that. They will say that baptism is what? Because it is a work of man. I'm sorry, did you not read the verse before that where it said it is the power of God unto salvation? Chapter 15. It's the power of God unto salvation. So if the power of God is what raised Jesus from the grave, guess what raises us from the watery grave to live a new person as well? The power of God. It's a work, all right, but it's the work of God. It's not a work of man. In both cases, Jesus' case and our case, both are required to put their faith in God and act. God, through his Spirit, raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus didn't raise himself. He was raised by God and his Spirit. His Spirit, and likewise, Romans 6, raises us from the watery grave, resurrected to be a new person in Christ. Okay? So that's what the power of God does, not what man does. Man just has to have the faith and just basically say, okay, I'm going to do it. As the world says, this is foolishness. It makes no sense. But once it's done, because God says, that's where the power is. So I just wanted to emphasize that because I know last week the writer in the book went straight on into the resurrection because this is what opened the door for the discussion about resurrection because it was talking about a resurrected spiritual body, the one we live today, and then it went on to say, yeah, and about the resurrection, and it goes on from there, and that's where John pretty much concentrated last week. So I wanted to bring that out. Does that make sense, what I'm talking about there? Do you understand that? Write that down because there is only about one, I think there's maybe one other place that really says this is the gospel and that is what saves you. The good news of Jesus Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection, and our uniting with him in that. All right. Going on, last week, we also talked about the resurrection of the dead. Without the resurrection, what is our faith worth? Nada. Because if there was no resurrection, there's no new life, there's no forgiveness, there's not anything. It was all a joke. And that's basically what Paul says. Our faith is futile and we're still in sin. There is no forgiveness of sins. He goes on to say that with Adam came death, but with Christ came a new life, a resurrection. Now Christ is ruling until all his enemies are under his feet, and the last enemy to defeat is who? Death. That's right. He'll defeat Satan before he defeats death. Death is the last one to be defeated. And then he went on into a discussion of how the dead are raised. What kind of body will they have? And then you know what he said about that? That's a foolish question. Did y'all catch that? Silly question. Why would he say that? Two reasons. One is he thought it was obvious, and he goes on with the analogy. But more importantly is, does it matter? And so he says, silly question. Silly question. All new life comes from a buried seed. You have a grown stalk of corn, it dies, the seed falls out, is buried, and guess what comes back? A whole bunch, another seed? No, the seed grows into a full new life. And he's basically saying the same thing happens with us. We die, we're buried, planted in the ground, and then comes from that a new life, a new body. And then it's planted perishable, going to die, but it's raised up to be imperishable. It's buried a natural body. It's raised up a spiritual body. The first Adam was a physical brought a physical being into place. The last Adam brings a spiritual being. What does that body look like? What'd you all decide? There it was, right there. Don't know. It's going to be different. You know, and I was talking to John about it, and the only thing I really know about it is it's imperishable, it's spiritual, and when they see you, they recognize you, but they don't recognize you. How is that? Because they didn't recognize Jesus at first, but then they did, mostly by what he did and what he said. So he was obviously looking different. One time they said, don't even touch me. Other times he says, you can feel him. I don't know. So I go back to what Paul said. Silly question. It's nice to talk about, try to figure out, I guess, because we're all curious. We all want to know what we are. Anyway, but the resurrection of the dead, the most important thing to remember is this. Jesus was resurrected, and because he was, there will be a resurrection, and we will be a part of it. The question is where we're going to be at that point, and that's where the whole book is really coming and concentrating on. As a matter of fact, he finishes up the chapter, and he says this, and that's where I wanted to start today. At the end of chapter 15, he says, therefore, right after he says, Jesus gives us victory, thanks be to God, he gives us victory through our Lord. Death has been swallowed up in victory, therefore stand firm, let nothing move you. And then in 58, he goes on to say, give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because your labor, your labor is not in vain. So he's basically saying, you know it, we've talked about it, you know what God's done for you through through the gospel, go to work. Go to work. Go to work. Okay? Your work is not in vain. And that's kind of where he brings it into this wrapping up of this letter to the Corinthians. The next thing he does is he brings in something that seems to be kind of totally different. As a matter of fact, when we talk about giving in the New Testament, where do we get it from? Just a couple places. This is one of them. And when he talks about giving, he says to gather up a collection. When? First day of the week. First day of the week. That tells you a couple things. When did they meet? He wouldn't have said meet on the gathered on the first day of the week if they were meeting monthly or quarterly or annually or whenever they got time to get together. We had a good day, let's go get together. Even though they did all those things, but they always met on the first day, which goes back to what Jesus said. Remember me until I come. Remember this. And so they met on the first day of the week. So that's one thing you get out of it. The other thing he was saying is to gather a collection. Who's the collection for? The church. Which church? Which Lord? There's only one Lord's church, but the Lord's church where? In Jerusalem. They wasn't even gathering it for the Corinthians wasn't even gathering it for themselves. And he had already given this message to others. They were gathering it for a group of people that were the church in a different place. Why? What did the verse before just say? Check verse 58. They are to do what? You know your labor is not in vain. Give yourself fully to the Lord. Give yourself, your finances, whatever you have. This is what he meant. This is one way they could give themselves fully. They were meeting a need of God's people. They just happened to be in Jerusalem. And so he tells them to gather all this for the churches, for the church in Jerusalem. He's going to get it. He's already mentioned from the church in Galatia. Does anybody remember where that's at? On my map. From, where Turkey is? Probably not. But let's say from Ephesus, if you know where that is, from the, what's that sea? All the way across over to the end of the Mediterranean Sea where Syria is, or Lebanon today is. That whole northern place up there was Galatia, okay? That's where the churches of Galatia is, and the letter was written to. As it comes on over and it joins the whatever sea that's between that with Turkey and Greece today. Is it the Adriatic? I get that and the other one mixed up. Is it the Aegean? It's the Aegean. Okay, the Adriatic's between Italy. I always get them flipped. And I'm like, they all start with words I don't understand. Anyway, so there, where Ephesus is and where Paul is at is right now in western Turkey. All that is eastern Turkey, Galatia is today. That whole area right there above the Mediterranean Sea there is modern-day Turkey, okay? So in western Turkey, on the shore, that's where Ephesus is. That's where Paul wrote this letter, if you remember, while he was spending his 3 years there that we studied and talked about when we studied the book of Ephesus a year or so ago. So here he is. He's doing that. He's already told the church in Ephesus. He's gathering up money from them. And then he says, I'm going to head your way to these Corinthians. And when I do, I'm going to go through Macedonia. Does anybody remember where that is? Macedonian call? North? North? No, it's north of Greece. It's also north and west of Turkey, Istanbul, over that way, Troas, all these places, and what we refer to in the Old Testament as Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, all those places, northern Greece, on the, whatever sea that was, Aegean Sea. Okay? And as you come down, southern part of Greece, when you get down around Athens, that was not called Greece either. What was that called? Achaia. That's where Corinth is in Achaia. And Athens and all that. And that's where he's going to come to them. So he's gathering up money all the way from Turkey, all the way up into Istanbul, all the way around, and all those Anias, whatever. I don't remember all the names today because they've been changed around. But northern Greece, all the way down to the southern part of Greece. He's gathering up money from them to do it. He's doing it on the first day of the week. And he says to set aside how much? In accordance with set aside a sum of money in accordance with your income, based on what you have, what you're getting. Set aside some each week. Doesn't say 5%, 10%, 20%. Doesn't say $1, 2 mites. Doesn't say a denarius. It doesn't say any of that. It says according to. And in other places we read that it's for us to decide what that is, and keeping in mind that God's listening to us and deciding how our heart is. All right. It says, give it on the first day of the week, saving it up. And then when he comes, he's going to get it, and he's going to send it or take it to Jerusalem, and he's going to have honorable men with letters go and present it to the church there in Jerusalem. Okay? So he's kind of making his plans. All this in chapter 16 is about his plans for the future, and that's the first thing he's going to do is take this contribution, go help out the church in Jerusalem. They need it. Was he taking it to them because that was the mother church? They needed to pay their tithe or something? No. There was a famine, as was common, and taking it to them in order to provide for the church there, to help them. This would have been in the late 50s. All right? Keep in mind, in about 70, they're going to be obliterated by the Romans. All right. So here we are. He does that. Then he goes on and starts talking about some of his plans, some of his travels. He says, and after I go through Macedonia, in other words, he's going to leave Ephesus and going to head up through Macedonia, and he starts describing some of the things he's going to do. And one of the first things is he is at Ephesus. He is here. He has great, as we studied in Ephesians, he has a great door opportunity open to him. If you remember, we talked about how Ephesus was a seaport and a doorway to the east. It also was in the main road from Rome, went right through Ephesus, going from Syria all the way up through Ephesus and around through Berea and headed toward Rome on the Appian Way. All of these things take place. This is where all this takes place. It was a perfect place for him to sit and spread the gospel, and that's why the book of Ephesians was so important, what it had to say, is because it went out from to the whole world from that one point. And he was saying, in this writing right here in the 16th chapter, I have such a great opportunity happening to me right here. But he also points out that what's happening to those people. It's getting a little stressful. In Ephesus, things aren't, getting a little tense. Things are getting a little, people are not getting happy. We know what happened in Ephesus eventually, right? It was all but ran out. He was arrested and everything worked out to his advantage, but in the meantime, the whole city's in an uproar, and that's not good when you're a Roman, or in Rome, or Roman provinces. And so things are about to get heated up. It hasn't happened yet, the thing with the silversmith, but it's coming. And what he says there is that he wants to leave for Macedonia, which is Philippi, Thessalonica, etc., but he's not planning on doing that until when? Everybody catch that? No? Pentecost. When is Pentecost? Do what? Nope. Pente means 50 after Easter. So if Easter's in late March or sometime in April, you could add 2 months to that, and you're looking at late May right now. Now is about Pentecost, plus or minus, depending upon how the clock calendar follows that year. But about now would be when Pentecost. So he was going to stay there till Pentecost, and then he was going to go on. We find that the trouble happened, and then he leaves and heads for there about Pentecost, somewhere around the spring. And that would have been the spring of probably about 56. So here he is. He leaves for Macedonia. He goes up through Philippi, Thessalonica. He receives all these things, these contributions and letters and people and everything. And as he leaves there, while he's there, he gets word, probably from Timothy, and we'll talk about that why in just a second. But he gets word from them that this first letter, which is really about the second letter, so 1 Corinthians was received and apparently did some good. This letter, with all these negatives in it, did some good. And he was really worried about it. And so in 2 Corinthians, we find that even the man who was sleeping with his father's wife had repented. Things had changed. Things were better. So he gets a good report back while he's en route to them. And we find that that's when he writes 2 Corinthians to them, saying, great, I've got the message, I'm glad to hear it, and I'm coming to you, and those kind of things. Okay? So here he is en route, heading that way, with the goal of getting to Corinth by, Jan? By winter. That's where they got the winter. Trying to get to Corinth by winter. And so as he arrives there in Corinth, Achaia, for the winter, he gets there probably the winter of 56, 57. It may be in 55, 56. You know, they're all plus or minus a year or two because nobody has an accurate thing. They got an idea of the chronology, but it's plus or minus a year or so. And so right around a winter of 56 or 55 or 57, somewhere in there, he arrives there, and he's going to spend about 3 months. He's going to spend the winter there. And that's what his plan is. After that, what was his plan? Where was he going to go? He was going to send the contribution to Jerusalem with other men unless he had to go. But he's going to send it by the other men. His intent was to go from there to Rome and then to Spain. As a matter of fact, while he's there in that winter, 56, 57, somewhere in there, he writes the book of Romans, the book we just got finished studying on Wednesday night. He writes the book of Romans as he's heading that direction. And even in the book of Romans, I think at the end of the book, 15, he says, I'm looking to come to you and see you in Rome and then coming on to Spain. So his plan was to go to Rome, spend some time in Rome, in the marketplace, or the place where he always would go, the Agora, I think was the word. And then after that, he was going to go to Spain. Question for you. If he's going to Spain, where would he go? I didn't know that, but I found that out. We would have thought, well, I don't know, Madrid? No. If you're sailing away from Rome and you land at a seaport on the Mediterranean, we would say Barcelona. Nope, Barcelona was not in existence. But about 50 miles down the coast is a place called Tarragona. Tarragona was the seaport, Roman seaport. It was where they had established their community just like they had in Corinth and everything else. It was the major place in Spain. When we went to Europe last summer, we went and visited a good brother, Oscarito, from Cuba. His wife and children, or child and one to be, are there. He started a church in his house right there. Oscar's the one that preached here from this pulpit one time. He is there, and as we look out his window on the third story, and we look out, there's the ruins of the Roman agora, or whatever, what do you call it, marketplace and everything right there that are under excavation as we speak, and the sea is sitting right there looking at you. That's the place where Paul was intending to go, and incidentally, non-biblical history, but secular when you talk about the world, secular history indicates that he did, in fact, after his first imprisonment, go to Rome, left Rome and went to Spain and places over there or whatever. So he would have gone there and preached. That was his plan. We know that eventually he changed his mind. He had to take it, and we look in Acts chapter 20, and we see that he decided it was important for him to take the money and the people with him and take it to Syria, to Jerusalem. So we find that he's going to eventually take the money back there, and that's where he's going to be arrested, and everything is going to go bad for him at that point. And so we're going to find that he's going to leave Corinth after the winter in the spring of probably 57 and go north back around. They were going to attack him, according to Acts, and kill him. So he took the land route around to Ephesus and then sailed from Ephesus after meeting with the elders there. So, or near Ephesus, let me rephrase that. So that was what he had planned to do, and that's what he did do. All right, so we look at that, and he talks about that. At the same time, in this last chapter, he also talks about his fellow workers. In verse 10, he says, if Timothy comes, see to it that he has nothing to fear while he's with you. for he's carrying on the work of the Lord just as I am. So now Paul has written this letter, and he's got to send, he's in Ephesus, and he's got to send it to Corinth. How do you send it? UPS? FedEx? Overnight? 2-day? No. To make snail mail look slow. I mean fast, as we would say. He sends it, and we find that he sends it with somebody that's been working with him. And if you remember, in Ephesus, Timothy was there, Luke was there, he had been, but he wasn't there. He was sent to Corinth. Aquila and Priscilla were there. And so from there, he sends somebody from him that can speak and say, these are my words. Treat him with no fear, for he's carrying on the work of the Lord just as I. Timothy is going to be his representative, carrying this letter over there to him, reading it to him, and say, this is from Paul. Okay? So that's what Timothy's about to do. He's about to carry it over there. When he goes, he also goes with him. And if you go down a little further, you find that Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Achaicus were going with him. Because he says, I'm glad they came from you, and they're going back. They're the ones that came with the message, saying, hey, we got problems in Corinth. So you send the letter back. You don't send it with these 3 guys, because what is the people at the church over there going to do when they get slammed around? Oh, you're just making that up. So Paul sends them back along with his own personal emissary to go over there and say, this is the words of Paul. This is the message. So he takes it and sends it back to them. All right? So he sends them back, and he makes an interesting note here that I think is important. He says, now about our brother, verse 12, Apollos, I strongly urged him to go to you with the brothers, but he was quite unwilling to go now, but he will go when he has the opportunity. In the very beginning of this book, they were having divisions. Divisions between who? Apollos and Paul. Some said, I'm of Apollos, and some said, I'm of Paul. Apollos came with the group over here saying that we've got this problem over here, and all the issues there, so he was the messenger that came here, and he was caught in the crossfire. Paul had sent him from Ephesus to Corinth to do his job, to work with him over there. Now Apollos is coming back and saying, all we've got is a mess, and some people don't like me. They're all following, saying they're not going to listen to me. They only listen to Paul. Others are following after me. We got this mess and this problem over here, and all these things going on. And does Apollos want to run back and meet that? Doesn't appear so. He was I think he almost the indication I get is that he came away from this, Some people write, and I think our writer talked about the confrontation between Paul and Apollos like they were against each other. And it wasn't. I think Apollos came to him and said, we got a problem. And Paul writes back and says, we're both apostles in a way, as Billy was talking about, because we're all messengers. One came and planted, one came and watered. Remember when we studied that? And so he tries to say, we're all working together. You just got it all mixed up back there at the church. So Apollos is kind of reluctant to return, but he's going to. He said he would. Paul said he'll go when he has the opportunity. So he will probably go with Paul when Paul makes this journey. We don't know. All right, somebody else. Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned. Where have they been working? In Ephesus. What are they doing? They're going to stay there. Matter of fact, they're going to send their greetings and everything on from Ephesus through Timothy to the church there. They're going to stay working. So we talk about some of his fellow workers, and he deals with them and talks about in this last chapter, as Paul does a lot when he starts trying to say hi and who's doing what, where's going things. All right, so fellow workers. And then I want to take just a minute in his final message. Already touched on it. The whole message started with the foolishness of the cross of God and the cross versus the wisdom of man and all their self-arrogance. We've talked about the fact everything was about love versus agape versus eros. It's this conflict. And so here he says in verse 16:13, he says, be on your guard. Why? Well, we saw all the problems that they were encountering from all the people in all the temples and all the things going on. Stand firm in the faith. Stand strong. Be men of courage. Be strong. And then he says, do everything in agape. This whole book, as we pointed out from the beginning, everything was about them wanting what they wanted. And he's saying it's not. The message of the cross is what? Don't be selfish. What did Jesus do? Did he die on the cross for himself? He could have called how many angels? No. He was selfless in his act, and in doing so, he brought the good news to all of us, the gospel. The message of the cross is stupid to people, but it's not, because what it does, it's about agape. And that was his whole message through the whole book of Corinthians. He said the message of the cross is about selflessness. Have the mind of Christ. All these came out of all the studies we said. And then he goes through, and I'm going to give you this list. We've studied this over the last 13 weeks. He says, eliminate jealousy, quarreling, judgmental attitudes, arrogance, sexual immorality, lawsuits, self-importance, greed, impropriety in worship, and worldly thinking. Look at the things he took a whack at. And every single one of them was the opposite of agape. Opposite of what Jesus did on the cross for them. And so he's saying, put all that away, give up seeking your own good, give up your own rights, and don't cause a brother to be lost, but be all things to all people, whatever it takes to save people. All these are agape, selflessness. Exercise self-control and seek the good of others at all times. That's the message of 1 Corinthians. In a nutshell. It's a lot of stuff, and it's the only book in the New Testament that really deals with all of those things that the world teaches and says, yeah, that's okay. And that's the only place where you really get it all just time after time after time saying, that's not who God is. That's not who our Lord is. We need to be this other way. All right, next week we're going to start the new study. The new study is going to be on Ezra and Nehemiah, which will go back and actually tag on from the end of Esther, where Esther was, and some of the other studies we looked at. And Corey's going to pick that up first of next week, or next Sunday. Any other questions, thoughts before I go? All right, see you next week.